I want to begin this morning by asking you a question. Is there anybody in here that has never failed? No, not a single hand. The fact is, if you live long enough, and if you attempt to do and to be things in life, you will no doubt encounter failure. Be failure in relationships, could be failure in parenting, could be failures at work, could be failures at school, it could even be failures in one's health. I think just pretty much everybody can identify with failure in one form or another. And likewise, we know that in the success-oriented world in which we live, it can be pretty difficult to try and cope with failure. In fact, the media even revels, I think, in the famous falling from grace, having failure. In fact, they go so far as to encourage the public to kind of join in. Do they not? It really is kind of sad when you stop to think about it that failure too often results in joy and gloating rather than sympathy with the one who has fallen or who has failed. How many of you in here ever watched it's on PBS, Antiques Roadshow? Anybody ever watched that? Yeah, I see lots of hands out there. On one episode, there was this individual who brought in a dinner menu from, of all places, the Titanic. The appraiser, rightfully so, acknowledged that it was a rare relic from that particular disaster, the sinking of what was considered an unsinkable ship with a loss of 1,514 lives. Here's the thing, that dinner menu was estimated to be worth between $50,000 and $100,000. And with permanent museums and traveling exhibitions, there is no telling how much that specific failure has made. And the success that it's kind of acquired, interestingly enough, to some degree. Here's the thing. Failure can either teach us or it can destroy us. And in some cultures, failure requires payment with your life without any chance of redemption, without any opportunity to learn a lesson and to start over, determined that you'll do better. If you have your Bibles or New Testaments with you this morning, I invite you to turn to Mark's Gospel. Mark chapter 6. We've been in Mark in recent weeks. We've talked about depression. We've talked about fear. And this morning I want us to talk briefly about a failure. Mark chapter 6, I want to begin reading in verse 1. Where Mark tells us that Jesus left there and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things, they asked? What's this wisdom that has been given him? What are the remarkable miracles he's performing? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home. Mark then tells us that he could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. Then Jesus went around teaching from village to village, calling the 12 to him. He began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over impure spirits. These were his instructions. Take nothing for the journey except a staff. No bread, no bag, no money in your belts. Wear sandals, but not an extra shirt. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town. And if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, leave that place and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. They went out and preached. They went out and preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. In our text for today, Jesus experiences failure for himself. And he appears to have expected his disciples to fail as well. My particular Bible leads this section of text, labels it as the rejection, or as a prophet without honor. Other translations may have the heading, the rejection of Jesus at Nazareth. And in the last part of our text for this morning, Jesus gives his disciples instructions about what they are to do when they are rejected or when they fail. Now, for those of you who've been here, we all know that Jesus has simply been moving from one success to another in his ministry. I mean, Mark has been describing some pretty amazing miracles. Calming the storm, healing a man possessed with demons, raising Jairus' daughter back to life, as we talked about last Sunday. Now, looking for a time to simply get away and have some retreat, Jesus heads back to his hometown of Nazareth. And back in his home synagogue, he began to teach. And unlike the previous places where people are astonished at his teaching, in Nazareth they're just astounded by him. Look again at what verse 2 says. Where did this man get these things? What's this wisdom that has been given him that he even does miracles? Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't this Mary's son, the brother of James and Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And notice what Mark says next. They took offense at him. They took offense at him. According to Mark, this is the third time Jesus was to experience failure in his ministry. You see, in Mark chapter 3, verse 21, he tells us that, quote, when his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, he's out of his mind. Brothers and sisters try again to remove him from his teaching ministry. And this third time, now in his own hometown, he meets rejection yet again, prompting him to say that very famous line, only in his hometown, among his relatives, and in his own house is a prophet without honor. And then we turn to the commissioning of the disciples as they're about to go forward in mission. Jesus tells them what to do. He also tells them what to expect. Jesus tells them that they'll go 2 by 2 into the countryside, preaching with authority over evil spirits. They weren't to take anything for the journey except their staff. They were to carry nothing to eat. They weren't to carry a bag. They weren't to take any money. They weren't even expected to have a second cloak or shirt. They were to wear sandals, and that pretty much is it. Sandals and a staff, that's it. And if that's not enough, Jesus continues by preparing them for failure when he tells them, quote, and if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, what are they to do? Shake the dust off your feet when you leave as a testimony against them. I think Jesus knew. You see, I think Jesus knew that the disciples were not going to be immune from failure. Okay? Simply because they were going in His name. I think Jesus knew that for His disciples that He's sending out 2 by 2, I think He knew that failure was going to be a real possibility. And the words He spoke to them were words that were meant to show them how to carry on when it happened. But can we be honest with one another? There's not a single one of us that likes to hear that we're going to have to face failure in life. We just don't like it. You know, we want the bed of roses. We want everything to go smoothly, calm waters. Everything to go perfectly. None of us like to hear that we're going to have to face failure in life. However, I think understanding that can help you and I know how to carry on when we fail. In fact, it may very well have been Jesus who inspired those signs, which are relevant even today, simply said, keep calm and carry on. In essence, Jesus is telling His disciples, listen, don't fear failure. Shake off the dust and move on. In other words, the lesson is to somehow turn failure into something good and positive. To turn some failure into something meaningful. Why? Because failure can lead to better things. I was quizzing Judy earlier. We were out in the coffee area. Did you know Vincent van Gogh never sold a single painting during his lifetime? Okay. Mozart wrote his Requiem while dying with pneumonia. And Handel wrote the Messiah while on his last legs following a stroke. Did you know that 2 of those 3 individuals lived in abject poverty? And yet, all of them, in the very same way, were driven to give their very best despite their adversity. In much the same way that you and I have to shake the dust off our feet and carry on. Because here's the thing. Failure can also be creative. When failure focuses us out of our safe or stale routines. Sometimes in order to change, what's needed most is real courage. But at the same time, failure can also be an impetus that enables us to take a risk. It can be failure that can cause us to sometimes look to change and to be better. Second thing I would say is failure can be failure for Christ. And this is the most troubling, I suppose, of any, in that sometimes failure happens when we are doing every single thing in our power to serve Jesus Christ. You know? Now, I will tell you, and I'll admit it up front, that there are some theologies that promise health, wealth, and success if you'll only follow Jesus. But Jesus seems to be telling His disciples that they're going to experience some kind of rejection, the same kind of rejection that He Himself experienced. And we also probably ought to keep in mind that almost every one of the first 12 disciples suffered martyrdom for Jesus. And that's not getting into the history of the early church. And countless others who also suffered martyrdom, even to the present day. What I would say at this point is failure is good when the failure is for the sake of Jesus Christ. Theodore Roosevelt once said, quote, "Far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy nor suffer much because they live in the great twilight that knows neither victory or defeat." End quote. But there's one last thing I want to tell you about failure, and that is this. Failure is not the end of the world. Failure is not some debilitating disease that ruins us for all of eternity. Not at all. In fact, we probably shouldn't even be afraid to fail. We simply ought to expect failure from time to time. But then we have to exercise that ritual for failure. We have to shake off the dust and simply move on. Ernest Hemingway has said, quote, "Life breaks all of us, but some of us are strong in the broken places," end quote. I like that phrase. Strong in the broken places. Because you see, that's a phrase that ought to encourage all of us. It ought to serve as encouragement for each and every one of us that's ever been visited by anxiety and loss. Anyone who's ever been visited by pain and dread. Anyone who's ever failed. We should find encouragement in that. In Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, in chapter 12 of that book, Paul tells of a man who has seen and experienced the third heaven. Now, we now know that he was making a reference to himself, and even though we don't know the specifics of the experience, other than the fact that Paul is apparently and obediently following a directive from God. 2 Corinthians is one of those books in Scripture that it's very interesting. Because it is one of those letters that is entirely about Paul reflecting on his own brokenness, but wanting also the ability to cope with unnamed infirmities. If you go back and read chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, 3 times the Apostle Paul asked God to relieve him of the issues that oppress him. And 3 times God reminds him that he has all of the gifts that he needs. Now, while scholars have debated for centuries what Paul's, quote, thorn was, Paul says that it's better with God's help to withstand our human frailties, for it is in those periods of suffering that we find ourselves drawn closer to God. It's also in those times that we are reminded of His promises. God's promise that He will supply our needs. God's promise that all things work together for good to those who are called according to His purpose. The promise that His grace will always be sufficient. Those are the promises that God made to Paul. Those are the very same promises that God makes to each and every one of us. Listen, life may take its toll. And when it does, we are left with an option. When life takes its toll, you and I can simply cave into it, or we can be strengthened by it. Knowing that God is with us as we try our best to live according to His wisdom and His will by following the ways of Jesus Christ. Like Hemingway said, life breaks all of us. Yet many of us are strong in the broken places. The good news this morning is that God is with us in the broken places. God's grace is sufficient in the broken places. There are times when you and I simply have to shake off the dust and move on. And move on.